Hello, friends and Hannibal family, and welcome to the Deconstructing Hannibal podcast, where we take the show apart piece by piece. This is Sahaya. It's me. I just have my hair up. Those of you who are listening, you have no idea what my hair looks like. Please do remember we do have a video version of this podcast if you ever want to see my face. Okay. So this is going to be a solo episode. As you know, I've finished up deconstructing season 1, the last couple episodes. The last one was with my brother, and it was just sort of a thank you to my brother for helping me with all of my tech stuff on the podcast, and just sort of like he and I did, sort of digging into where I came from as a Fannibal. And then before that, I had the wonderful episode with Bryan Fuller, who so graciously um, came onto the podcast and answered a lot of my fervent questions. I still have lots of questions to ask him, and he promised me he'd come back. So you guys be looking out for that in the future. It might not be till a little later on, but there we are. So what I'm talking about this week or this episode, and the next couple episodes are going to be solo episodes, this is going to be the preview for season 2 because we finished season 1 and we're about to start talking about season 2. So this is the preview for season 2. And then next week I will begin season 2 in earnest, starting at the bottom of the plot diagram, starting with setting, right? There are a lot of the same settings, obviously a lot of the same settings. The main settings in the show still continue into season 2, things like Will's house, Hannibal's office, the BAU, the BSHCI, etc. But we have a lot of, I won't say a lot of, not as many as season 3, but we have several very interesting new places that we see in season 2 that I'll be talking about in a couple of settings episodes. I need to slow down. Everybody breathe with me. Okay. Settings episodes that I'll be doing after this one. However, today I want to talk to you guys about sort of a preview of what we've got coming up in season 2, or what happened in season 2, and kind of talk about how we got here. Okay. So as you know, I'm taking the story through the plot diagram. And because this is a 3-season show, you kind of have a plot diagram for each season. And then there's sort of a larger plot diagram, which I'll talk about when I finish deconstructing season 3. But just to remind us of what happened in season 1 with regards to the plot diagram, okay? I'm going to show you guys the plot diagram. Here it is, as I put it together. Those of you listening, I'm going to talk through it real quick. If you want to see a picture of it, there's a picture of it at my Patreon. There's a picture of it on my Instagram, and I'll leave links in the episode links for this episode. So if you guys, and this is just a template that I've got online somewhere. Remember, the plot diagram is also called Freytag's pyramid, okay? It has all sorts of different accoutrements and fanglediness depending on who's written the diagram and what it is that you're trying to do. But as you can see, we've got the classic sort of up to the top, and then like the action falls off, and then the bottom, right? And so we've got some information here that I've filled out. This is the plot map for Hannibal season 1. The author is Bryan Fuller and the others, right? You see my name over here in the corner, okay? So if you look down into the left-hand corner here, you'll see right here, you'll see that there is an exposition box, right? And so our settings of season 1 in the exposition: Baltimore, Maryland; Washington, D.C., Wolf Trap, Virginia, and the surrounding areas. For the situation, I just put, there's a lot of killing going on. Characters are Hannibal Lecter, Will Graham, Jack Crawford, and more. The climate and mood is beautiful, terrifying, gorgeous, and grotesque. I just finished reading Brian Raftery's Hannibal Lecter, A Life biography, and he described Hannibal as, let me see if I get this right, he said, moody, bloody, sexy, strange. And I thought about, ooh, that's something we can have for season 4, sort of set to the tune of Megan Thee Stallion's Savage, like moody, bloody, sexy, strange. It's like, well, that's a perfect description of Hannibal, isn't it? And so we see here the inciting incident, which I talked about in one of my episodes, which is Will agreeing to help Jack and find the Minnesota Shrike, this sort of borrowed imagination there. Then we have the main conflict. Our protagonist is Will Graham, our antagonist is Hannibal. I know for some people that's up for debate, but in the way that the story, if we're applying it to Freitag's Pyramid, that's the way it shakes out. Will Graham is the protagonist of season 1, okay? These things get blurry a little later on, but he's definitely the protagonist of season 1, and Hannibal is the antagonist, even when Will doesn't know that he's the antagonist, right? And so the main conflict being that Will catches killers and Hannibal's a killer. He doesn't know for a good deal of the season that Hannibal is a killer, but that's the main conflict, is that Will's entire job in this life is to stop people like Hannibal from doing what it is that they do. Hang on, liquid. So that's our main conflict, right? So then we have the inciting incident, Will going to help Jack find the Minnesota Shrike, right? Then we've got the rising action, and I put 3 events here. I talked about 2 of them being the sort of hinges on which the plot turns. The first one being Hannibal calling Garrett Jacob Hobbs and telling him, they know that that's one of the things that sets the plot into motion, that after which things cannot be the same, right? And that if that didn't happen, things in the plot would have gone wildly differently, right? I put also this diagram had 3 sort of major rising action things. So I put the ambulance scene in Sorbet because I believe that that's where Will's subconscious mind really starts to go into overdrive about the possibility of Hannibal being more than he can see, right? And then we have the second hinge that I said the plot turned on, which is Will agreeing to help Hannibal cover Abigail's murder of Nick Boyle, right? Then at the very top, we have the climax of season 1, which is Will in the last episode, which is Will confronting Hannibal in the Hobbs's kitchen in Savaro, right? Basically saying, I can see you now. The scales have fallen from my eyes. I know who you are. I know what you are. And then the rapidly falling action, Jack coming in and shooting Will being hospitalized, and then our resolution that Will is charged with the copycat's murders and imprisoned in the BSHCI while Hannibal remains free. Okay. The themes and motifs that we saw in season 1, the motifs that I talked about, and please remember there's lots more. Okay. But the themes that I talked about in season 1 were mirrors, breakfast, knives, scars, teacups, the Raven Stag, and Staggy. Okay. Mirrors, knives, scars, teacups, Raven Stag, and Staggy all continue into season 2, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. Okay. Themes are finding family and making our own families, sort of found families, taking power and claiming our own power, taking our power back from other people, the damage caused by the wielders of power, fate versus free will, that old chestnut, and wild instinct versus civilized morality, which is what I believe that the Raven Stag and the Stag Man are the sort of meaning, the sort of standard bearers of that theme, the sort of meaning bearers of that theme of wild instinct versus civilized morality. Okay, so that's where we ended season 1. Okay, now I want to talk just a little bit about the title, the names of the episodes, like the titles of the episodes. I didn't talk about that before. And I realized when I got to this that I was like, oh, you didn't talk about the names of the episodes. So that's sort of why I've titled this episode what I have, which is From France to Japan. So in the first season, as you guys know, the title of every episode is a course in the classic French 17 course meal, right? And a lot of these align to sort of, in America, our courses in a meal are much more stripped down. We call the entree, to us, the entree is the main course, and that's not what it is in France and lots of other changes. But let's talk about what the titles of the season one episodes mean. Okay. And got my notes here. Obviously, the first episode, aperitif, is their little bites that you eat that are served with an alcoholic drink. And this we see this come back when we get into season 3 and we have the names of the Italian episodes because the first episode of there is called Aperitivo, which is the same idea, it's just in Italian, right? So the aperitif is here's a little snippy snip of food, here's a little alcoholic drink, right? Then you get the amuse-bouche, which is also a little snippy snip of food. It's not an appetizer. It's smaller than an appetizer. Amuse-bouche literally means mouth amuser. So it's supposed to be, 1 to 2 bites tops, right? If you've ever watched Iron Chef, particularly in the American version, I watched the Japanese version too. That's still my favorite, but in the American version of Iron Chef, at a certain point, you saw some of the chefs, the Bobby Flay and Morimoto and Simon and whatever, Cat Cora, take amuse bouches to with a little drink to the judging table, to the judges at the judging table to sort of set the theme for the meal, right? And so you can go and look at all of these episodes and see how the content of that episode matches the title of the episode. Now, to a certain extent, they were in that order because they were going in the order of the French 17-course meal. But if you look at those episodes specifically, you can see how kind of the idea being there with aperitif and amuse-bouche is that they were sort of whetting the viewer's appetite for what more is to come, right? And then you got to episode 3, which was potage, and potage is soup, and that's the episode where Abigail wakes up and they take her back to Minnesota and she kills Nick Boyle and da 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 da. Like, so a soup and it's potage is a soup and it's sort of a hearty stew. So you sort of like this episode is carrying a lot of hearty weight with regards to the plot, right? It's a very plotty episode, like for the main storyline, right? So we had potage, which was 3. Then we had œuf, which means egg, and it's in French cuisine. It's an appetizer featuring eggs. Okay, so it's some kind of eggy appetizer. I'm sure the French don't necessarily. I don't know if the French have a version of deviled eggs. I can't just imagine my mom showing up with the to the French cuisine with our southern deviled eggs, with the yellow yolk in it and the paprika and da-da. Anyway, um, episode 5 is coquillas. Coquillas are scallops. Things like, for example, coquillas Saint Jacques, right? It's usually a scallop dish, or sometimes it can be a small kind of dainty dish served in a scallop-shaped dish, but typically it's scallops. Then you have the entree. Episode 6 was entree. And in French cuisine, the entree is another appetizer. So basically, there's a lot of courses in French cuisine at the beginning. They're just sort of appetizers. So you're just sort of grazing for a little while, I guess. Okay. So it's usually a meat appetizer. Okay. Then episode 7 is sorbet. Sorbet is what it sounds like. It's sorbet. It's flavored sorbet or ice served as a palate cleanser between courses. When my sister got married, she had a rehearsal dinner at this very fancy French restaurant, and I was, I don't know, 19 years old. I had been to very few very fancy restaurants in my entire life. And this was a very fancy restaurant. And in between courses, they brought me like a little quenelle of raspberry sorbet on top of a mint leaf. And I had no idea what was going on. I was like, what is happening right now? It was like, why do we have ice cream? And my my mom was explaining to me, it's a sorbet. I'm like, okay, but why? It's a palate cleanser. I'm like, okay, and there were finger bowls too. Like my little middle class mind was blown, but I know what they are now. Anyway, uh, episode 8 was fromage, which is a cheese course. Okay, easily understood. Then we have trou normande, which is considered a break. It stands for a break in the meal, and it's typically Calvados apple brandy poured over apple sorbet. So you have sorbet, and then you have some cheese, and then you have some more sorbet with alcohol in it. And then number 10, episode 10 was Buffet Freud. This is a chilled course. It could be terrines or pâtés or aspics. Um, I believe that Hannibal serves Jack the fish jello in season 2, but if he had served it to Jack in season 1, Buffet Freud would have been the episode to do it, because that's what an aspic is that sort of like jello mold with stuff in it, right? And I'm trying not to make a face, but episode 11 was roti, and roti, which sounds like, like rotating, like right. Um, Roti is roast game or a poultry course, so you're getting into like the really heavy courses of the meal. So you're getting into which it makes sense because you're getting into the very meat of the main plot line at like post episode 10 is where, the shit starts to get crazy, right? Then episode 12, Relevus, is large carved joints of meat or whole fish. So now you just got like whole big old pieces of meat, like turkey leg, like mutton. And then finally, episode 13, Savro, is a dish of pungent taste, such as anchovies on toast or pickled fruit. So it's something that's highly tasty. So something very umami and salty and sort of, and it's curious to me that you have this at sort of the end of the meal. But if you think about Savro episode 13, what happens in that episode is very Savro, because it is whetting your appetite with that very pungent, salty, sort of briny, like plot to and cliffhangeriness of it, of where we wind up at the end of season 1, making you want to eat more. So in terms of Hannibal, making you want to see more. Like at the end of season 1, you're like, no, 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 no. As a Will Graham stan, I'm like, no, 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 no. We can't leave Mr. Graham like this. Like, I know that because I've read the books, I know that eventually Will is the one responsible for putting Hannibal in prison, and Will is not in prison, but I don't like this. Like all through that last part of season 1, I'm just like, no, not my baby Will. So that's where we end in season 1, right? And I just want to point out, before I start talking about season 2, that I want to point out the beauty of the full circle of season 1. Okay, because if you think about an aperitif, where we start in aperitif, we start not there, but here. We start in aperitif, Will in front of the windows. This is literally like the first shot of aperitif. Him staring straight at the camera, okay, with that very sort of intense look on his face, right? Because he's about to go into the scene recreation of the Marlowe murder, right? And I asked Bryan a little bit about the Marlowe murder in the episode. I still meant to ask him and I forgot. I was I was just like, pick the important questions, right? Um and I forgot to ask him if, yes, I know that the Marlowe murder was sort of an unsolved FBI murder, but I don't know if Will is imagining all of this, or if Will investigated some of the Marlowe murder. I'm not sure. But anyway, so we see first shot of season 1 in aperitif, Will, looking at straight at the camera like this, right? And so then what we see next is Will in Savro. Once again, looking straight in the camera. This time he's looking at Hannibal, but looking straight in the camera like this. And we can see just from aperitif to Savro how everything that has happened to him has changed Will. The change in his face and the look on his face, just he's a man out for vengeance now. He has now Will Graham has nothing to lose, which makes him very dangerous. Okay. And so I just really appreciate the sort of full circle that season one comes from. We start with Will looking in the camera, straight in the camera. We end with Will looking straight in the camera, right? And in season two, we kind of have that full circleness as well, because we begin season two with the fight scene in Mizumono, and then it says 12 weeks later, and you're like, what? And then we kind of end, now mind you, things happen after the fight scene in Mizumono, but we end the season with that fight scene. So there's still that sort of like full circleness of season two, right? Now, season two started on February 28th, 2014, and ended on May 23rd, 2014. And some of the promo images that came out for Hannibal season two were very interesting. One of the first ones that came out, and I just found this the other day and I absolutely love it, is this image. And for those of you listening, it's an image of the Stag Man. And it's an image of the Stag Man wearing the plaid suit. So just imagine how we see the Stag Man in Hassun when he's, I believe it's Hassun, when Hannibal goes up onto the stand to testify, and what Will sees is the Stag Man in Hannibal's suit. So it's an image of that, of the Stag Man in Hannibal's suit. And he's got his hands clasped in front of him, and he's turned towards the camera in sort of profile. And then at the bottom of the picture, there's the numbers 2014, but they're spelled out with sort of kitchen implements. The 2 is spelled out with a very fancy kind of corkscrew, and the 0 is spelled out with sort of a plate, a charger plate, and on top of it is a smaller plate and a utensil. I think it's a fork. The 1 is a glass filled with red wine. And then the 4 is a knife that kind of has a napkin hanging off of it. It almost looks like a white flag, sort of like, oh no, there's a surrender in season 2. So, and I read that when this image was released by Bryan and the folks behind the show, that this piqued a lot of interest in what was going to happen in season 2, obviously, because we saw the Stag Man emerge in the show at such a late time. Like, he didn't come in, even though we had seen the Raven Stag so early in the show, but the Stag Man didn't really emerge until the last episode, until Savro, Liquid. And then we go on to see the Stag Man a lot in season 2. Okay. So we got this very interesting promo. And then I love some more of the sort of promo images of the show. For example, you see here, this is one of my favorite. This is the sort of whited out poster of Hugh Dancy in the Hannibal mask, except his Hannibal mask is clear because, we can't cover up the moneymaker. And him looking with that sort of deadly but seductive stare into the camera. I mean, there's no way you can't think this is not hot, because it's extremely hot. His hair is perfect. And it kind of reminds me of the scene in Manhunter when Will Graham goes to talk to Hannibal, because in that scene, if you've ever seen Manhunter, everything in the room is white. The walls are white, the bars of the cell are white, Hannibal's wearing all white. Everything in the scene practically is white, with the exception of Will Graham, who's in blue, right? But you can see how this would have, and the tagline on this is "Embrace the Madness." So sort of teasing that idea of like the shoe is on the other, the crazy shoe is on the other crazy foot. because Will is now in the BSHCI, right? He is, and that's why they've got him in the Hannibal mask, because he's in Hannibal. He's in the place that Hannibal will occupy at one time. Like at some time in the future, we know that this is Hannibal's destiny, except Will is there first, right? There were also some more interesting sort of promo images. There's this one that we have where we have Hannibal, and I call this, and for those of you listening, this is the plaid room that I've talked about before in the BSHCI. And you can see from those of you watching what I'm talking about, the floor is fucking plaid. And so when I say everything in this room is plaid, it's plaid. And over here you have Hannibal in his plaid suit. And then you have those diving cages that you see in season 2, that very often when people come to talk to um, prisoners in the BSHCI, that Chilton puts them in these I assume they're diving cages. They look like diving cages. And we've got Will in one in his prison jumpsuit. We've got Jack in the middle looking very apprehensive, and we've got Alana in the end one, right? And so, it's kind of a fun image. I mean, obviously, Will's the only one that's and Hannibal's standing off to the side, like, look at what the fuck I did. So that's interesting. We also had a series of these sort of what I would like to call fancier promos. In this one, you can see they did it in the plaid room again, except they threw down a rug, and there's these blue velvet chairs, and we've got Hannibal in the suit that we in the fandom call the suit. Okay, the iconic red and black plaid window pane check suit with the floral tie, the one that Mads stole, right? And I believe that Bryan has a copy of this suit because he's appeared several times in it as well. It's got to be made out of more fabric because he's definitely taller. But and then Alana's in this striking red dress. Caroline just looks absolutely fabulous in red. It's one of her best colors. And then she's standing next to Hannibal with her hand on Hannibal's shoulder. And then you've got Will sitting next to Hannibal in another one of these blue velvet chairs, and in his prison jumpsuit and his Velcro shoes. And he's got his hands out in front of him as sort of like a prayer thing, but sort of like, when you're thinking, and he's got his hands up underneath his chin, like he's propping up his chin, and his elbows are on his knees. And so it's kind of this image sort of portraying, you see Alana's standing next to Hannibal. She's got her hand on Hannibal's shoulder. So sort of like she's on Hannibal's side, right? And Will is kind of by himself, right? And then the last promo image that I'm going to show you that I really loved from this was this image of Will behind all of the antlers. And so it's like a cage of antlers, and we see Will behind it. And this was listed as a season 2 promo image, but I really feel like it would have to be season 1, but there's blood all over the antlers, but it could be season 2. And you see Will behind it, and he's just looking out through some of the branches of the antlers. His nose is like completely obscured, and you can see his eyes and his mouth, and he just looks like he's kind of trapped behind these antlers, right? Now, talking about season 2 and talking about, so we start with Will in the BSHCI, okay? And talking about, first off, I'm going to talk about the episode titles, because in season 1, we were in France, and we weren't in France, but with the episode titles were French, right? In season 2, we moved to Japan. And I'm sure that part of the reason we've moved to Japan is because of the Japanese influence in Hannibal's life from Harris's canon, okay? From his Aunt Murasaki and from Chiyo, right? So the episode titles for season 2 represent different kinds of dishes that you can have in what's known as a kaiseki meal, right? And so while season 1, the names of the dishes were from the 17-course French meal, like this large multi-course, just heavy, so many courses, so many different things to eat. the kaiseki courses in season 2 are sort of smaller, they're on a more delicate scale, Japanese food is more delicate, okay? Um, or at least for a kaiseki meal, okay? They're more delicate courses because the plot of season 2 is more tightly and specifically focused on the main characters and their relationships. We have a few outside killers. We've got James Gray, and we've got Catherine Pym's, and Matthew Brown, and Randall Tier, and Clark Ingram, but we don't have as many as we had in season 1 when we were sort of more in the procedural. And the killers that we have, and the outside killers that we have in season 2, are sort of more intricately woven in with the main plot line, right? So just like the Japanese courses here are smaller and more compact and more intricate, so is the plot line in season 2, right? So, as I've said, a kaiseki meal is a sequence of small dishes artistically arranged. There's a base meal that you get, and it comes with like miso soup and whatever. And then the chef can choose from other dishes, and very often the meal comes like all in its one own tray, right? And so a bento box meal is kind of like a smaller, more totable version of a kaiseki meal, right? So each, with the exception of Kaiseki, the first episode name, the episode titles in season 2 are um, types of dishes that you could possibly have in a kaiseki meal. Okay, so we've got kaiseki, the sequence of small dishes. That's episode 1. Episode 2 is sakizuke, which is it's like an amuse bouche. Okay, so that course is little bites, right? Then you have hasun, which is episode 3. That's sushi and some smaller side dishes, right? Then you have episode 4 is takiawase, and I'm doing my best to pronounce these. Any Japanese fanables that are listening to this, if you want to send me a message and correct my pronunciation, please do. I'm doing this as a Westerner, as a Southern Westerner for that matter. So I'm doing my best to pronounce these Japanese dishes. So takiawase is vegetables served with meat or fish or tofu. Then we have mukozuke, which is a sliced dish of seasonal sashimi. And for those of you that aren't sushi people, remember sushi and sashimi are similar, except sashimi is just the raw fish. It doesn't have the rice or the nori wrapped around it or anything like that. It's raw fish by itself on a plate. Sometimes you have dipping sauces and wasabi, whatever. Um, then we have fudomono. Fudomono is a dish with a lid. It comes with a lid on it, and it's usually soup, right? Then we have yakimono. Yakimono is flame grilled food, especially fish. So this is sort of the grilled portion of the kaiseki meal. Then you have suzakana, which is a small palate cleanser, usually a dish with vinegar. So it's a vinegary umami palate cleanser, right? Then we have shizakana, which is a substantial dish such as a hot pot, right? And if you've ever had a hot pot, it's like you got your base broth and then you put all sorts of stuff in it, like kind of like ramen, right? Then you have nakachoko, which is another palate cleanser. So just like in the French meal, they had a couple of palate cleansers. Here we've got another palate cleanser. This is like an acidic soup, okay? Then you have konomono, which is seasonal pickled vegetables. Then you have tomoan, which was episode 12, okay, which is a miso-based or vegetable soup served with rice. And then lastly, you have mizumono, which, believe it or not, is dessert, okay? It is a seasonal dessert, usually a fruit, a confection, an ice cream, or a cake. Now, for those of you who have seen mizumono, it when I think of dessert, I think of pleasure, right? Ice cream, cake, ice cream cake, cookies. I love cookies. Um, Mizumono is a dessert of pain. It's a dessert of pain and blood and rain. Anyway, that's what Mizumono means, okay? So those are our Japanese titles now. And so now, because we're starting a new season, or I'm starting my deconstruction of a new season, then we are starting a new plot diagram. So you can see, those of you watching, those of you listening, I have put up the plot diagram again, and we're starting a new plot diagram. You see, everything here is blank, except that the protagonist and the antagonist remain the same. Season 2, it's Will versus Hannibal, okay? And we're in Hannibal season 2. The authors are Bryan Fuller and the others that were writing with him. So we're going to start back down at the bottom of the pyramid down here with the exposition. And you see right there, it says setting. Okay. Um, I want to bring in here some things that Bryan, and I also found an interview with Hugh, said about season 2 in some interviews. From the past. Okay. In 2013, Bryan did an interview with William Bibbiani from Crave Online. And Bryan was talking about the new season. And he said um, that there's a new status quo for season 2. He said, it felt like we had to strike into new territory. We had to really shake up the world because we had the slow boil in the first season of, will they realize that Hannibal Lecter is who he is? Of course, the only character who does realize is quickly discredited. So that game begins anew in season 2, but under a completely different paradigm where you have Will institutionalized, Hannibal free, no one believing Will because he very clearly lost his mind and lost time, and so is an unreliable narrator in his own story. There's a very exciting dynamic Hitchcockian, like the man who knew too much. Okay. And if you think about it, season 2 is very Hitchcockian. Like if you've ever seen, for example, Vertigo or Rear Window, the sort of like the unreliable narratorness of it, sort of like, does Will know what he really knows? Like, we know he knows it because we know that Hannibal is the bad guy, because we know who Hannibal was before we started watching the show, most of us. But is what he's remembering accurate? Is there more to it that we're not seeing? Is his mind making things up? How much is the encephalitis still, still messing with him? How much did it mess with him before, right? So we go into season 2 with a lot of questions, right? And then in 2015, Bryan did an interview with Bryan and Hugh. No, I'm sorry. The Week did an interview with Bryan and Hugh. And the interviewer asked Bryan, he says, Bryan, I know you've talked about having a 7-season arc planned out. In terms of season 2, how much are you drawing from the mythology of the books and how much are you aiming to go your own route, right? And Bryan said, we've taken a lot from Red Dragon and even used even sentences out of context to kind of thread the DNA of Thomas Harris into our series. And now we are in completely uncharted territory. So that's very exciting because now it's a purely original story with seeds of things that you found in the book. Okay. We know in the book that Will Graham had a psychological breakdown after catching the Minnesota Shrike, which was Garrett Jacob Hobbs. So we've seen that come to pass in an unexpected way. Now we get to see a feistier, scrappier Will Graham who is no longer the unknowing victim. He's coming out swinging, which is really exciting. And we get to find our way back to Red Dragon over the next 2 seasons somehow, right? And this is one of the things that I love about season 2. I love season 2 Will Graham when he's in prison because he is in full possession of his power. He is, I think Hannibal says to him at some point in season 2, I think you're the most in control that you've ever been. And it's absolutely true. Okay. And perhaps what Will needed was an enemy to fight. He needed a clear enemy. like when he's chasing down the murderers and he's having to put himself in their mind or whatever, his mind fuses with their thoughts so much that it's got to be we can see from season 1 that it's so blurry for him to separate himself from them. But with Hannibal, he can separate himself very easily from that because Hannibal did this to him, right? And so he has a clear enemy, right? And so Will, I love not only because he's just smoking hot, but I love prison Will Graham. I love the prison Will supremacy because he is unmatched in sassiness, in sarcasm, in resting bitch face. I mean, he is just a bitch and it's glorious. He is such a beautiful brat and it's perfect because he's giving it to everybody that fucking dismissed him and discredited him in season 1. It's perfect. Anyway, in the week, they went on to ask Bryan, they said season 1 was mostly serialized, but it had a few standalone cases in addition to the ongoing mystery. Will season 2 change the structure? And I think this was an important thing to kind of pull out because one of the main differences, obviously, between season 1 and season 2 is the sort of abandonment of the killer of the week sort of procedural structure in season 2. There's a little bit of it at the beginning, but then we step away from it, right? By the time we get to Fudamono, we're it's just all Will and Hannibal all the time, right? So to this question, Bryan answered, the structure is definitely changing, but we are going to have those unique death tableaus and purple operatic murders that we saw in the first season because that became the signature of the show. We definitely want to embrace that in the second season, but in a way you wouldn't necessarily expect from seeing the first season. So we will have those pieces, perhaps not as frequently as we did in the first season. Primarily, it's a serialized story of what's Will Graham going to do next. Okay. And so and when I was talking to Bryan in the interview that I did with Bryan a couple episodes ago, you saw how much he, kind of had issue with things in season 1 that it wasn't necessarily the way that he totally wanted it to be. And we can see in season 2 that it has to be starting to go more of the way that Bryan wanted it to be because it was moving away from that procedural thing, right? And I'm not casting aspersions on procedural shows. I love procedural shows. Some of my favorite shows are procedural shows. But Bryan wanted to do something different, right? And the story was about Hannibal and Will. That's that's what the story was about. That's where the story needed to be, right? Um Also in that same episode, Hugh was being interviewed and the um the interviewer asked Will about, asked Hugh about Will in season 2, and Hugh responded, "At the same time, I think that going into season 2, going back to where we were talking about relationships, Will is now in a sense in a very pure place. His relationships were always compromised. His relationship with Jack is compromised. His relationship with Alana even is compromised. And in a sense, that's just writ large now. But one question has been answered for him, which is the question to some degree of what he's capable and the doubts that were in his mind. I think that to some extent, a superhero has just become aware of his powers and actually being able to control them to some extent. Whereas in the first season, he was at the mercy of them. And I think that I pulled that out because I think that's a very important description of it. In the first season, Will was at the mercy of his own specialness, his own uniqueness, his own ability, like his ability to see into the murderers' heads. To I mean, let's face it, Will is very intuitive, okay? That's part of the reason that things around him affect him so much empathically, because you have to be very emotionally intuitive in order to be empathetic, right? Um, so Will understands what the people around him are feeling he understands it all too well because he takes it upon himself, right? But now he's going to be using that emotional intuitiveness and that as more of a power against others as opposed to something that winds up hurting him. Now, I'm not saying that Will Graham doesn't get hurt in season 2. There's a lot of pain in season 2, let's just be frank. There's stabby pain, there's you just slept with me to make a baby pain, there's oh no, I lost a baby I never had pain. There's oh no, a guy crashed through my window pain. Like there's pain in season 2. But Will is is less of a victim, he's more in control. Like when he sends Matthew Brown to kill Hannibal, yes, you're kind of like, I don't want Hannibal to die, but you're also like, yes, Will, you go, Will. Like that's my bad bitch right there. And he is. He is a bad bitch, right? In season 2, especially. And that's what Brian's talking about when he's talking about Will's coming out swinging. Like he's the emotionally intuitive version of throwing hands. So that is where we start season 2 is Will um in prison, knowing that he's right about Hannibal and trying to find the evidence in his mind so he can convince the people who are his supposed friends who completely discounted him, right? And Hannibal trying to do everything that he can to stop that from happening up to a point. And then we see that Hannibal decides that he wants Will out of prison. And then what happens after that? Season 2 is not my favorite season. Season 3 is my favorite season because season 3 is like a gothic fever dream. But season 2 is season 2 is it's it's so moody and experiential and it's an experience. I mean, season 1's an experience, but season 2, when you get to the end of season 2, you're like, Jesus Christ. Like, whoo, like I remember after the first time I watched it, which was, I don't know, I've watched the series all the way through 7 or 8 times now. The first time when I finished watching season 2, I had to take like a break for like a month just to think about things. Like when I was watching, because you remember I was watching it in streaming because I wasn't there at the beginning. But like I would watch an episode and I'd have to think about it for like 2 days before I watched the next episode. And that was the first time. The second time I watched it through and then I took notes the whole time, right? And so after I finished season 2, I had to like I had to cry about Mizumono for, I don't know, 3 or 4 days. And then I had to just think about everything. And I don't think I started season 3 until like a month later, right? And I was just so happy that there was a season 3. I can't imagine the pain of the people who were watching it in real time thinking that everybody had just died in Hannibal's kitchen, especially Will, who's my baby. Anyway, okay, so that is our preview for season 2. Next episode, I will be starting with the settings of season 2. That will be episode 35. That will be a solo episode as well. And there's one major new setting in season 2, which is Muskrat Farm. I'm going to save that for episode 36 because it needs a good deal of time on its own. So in episode 35, I'm going to be talking about some of the smaller settings that we see that I've deemed to be important. Those being the courtroom that Will is being tried in, and that they find the judge's body in. Hannibal's, I'm going to call it his kill barn. I don't know what else to call it. I'm calling it the kill barn. The barn out in the middle of nowhere, I think it's in Gunpowder Falls State Park or somewhere up there, where he's got Miriam trapped in the well and all the accoutrement he uses to kill people. I guess he's got like his basement and he's got the kill barn and he's got the house on the cliffs, and they're all for different purposes, right? I guess when he has to do a big tableau, he goes out to the kill barn. So I'm going to call it, so talking about the courtroom, Hannibal's kill barn, Peter Bernardone's house. And Peter Bernardone only appears in 2 episodes, but to us Fanables, he's a major character. Um, for those of us who have had the pleasure of meeting Jeremy Davies, and I've met him twice now at Red Dragon, he's an amazing human being. He's so intelligent. When he talks, you're like, wow, he's so, like, deep, right? But in a good way, like, you could just sit and listen to him talk, he's amazing. And so even if that weren't the case, Peter would still be a major character, but to us in the fandom, Peter is a major character. So I'm gonna talk about Peter's house and James Gray's farm, where the Eye of God is, okay? So those are the settings that we'll have for in the first setting episode, which will be next episode, so episode 35. Um, I want to remind you guys to like and subscribe here on my YouTube channel. Um, Remember, if you're looking for me, you can find me on Blue Sky, Sahaya74 at Blue Sky. You can find me on Instagram, Sahaya the Fannibal. I have a Patreon, Deconstructing Hannibal, and of course, this YouTube channel. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please absolutely reach out to me. If you're a Fannibal family and you think maybe you want to be on a future episode, this is a podcast for Fannibal family, so reach out. Um, I want to say to my Fannibal family, I love you guys. I hope everything is going well for you. If things are not going well, please, as I've said before, reach out to a Fannibal that you trust, or just reach out to your Fannibal family in general. We can be found mostly on all social media sites. I'm not on Tumblr much, but there's a bunch on Tumblr. We're on Blue Sky. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. Um, I think our Threads presence isn't as large as it could be, but there's some of us there. Like, you can find us where you need us. If you need a Fannibal, just reach out for one. I love you guys. Bryan, if you're listening or watching, I just want to say hi. I love you. I hope everything's going well. And I want to say to you guys, as I always do, remember, it is fine to be weird because let's face it, all the best people are. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Bye.